Funding for this series is provided by the Herb Alpert Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and by Mutual of America. For over half a century, people from all walks of life have turned to Mutual of America for retirement and pension products.
The historian and teacher Howard Zinn grew up on the tough streets of Brooklyn, where he worked as a teenager in the shipyards. He went on to earn his doctorate in history from Columbia University, and while teaching college, became an activist in the civil rights movement and in the opposition to the Vietnam War. Among his many books is A People's History of the United States, written from the point of view of men and women left out of the official records of the American epic. Since its publication in 1980, it's become a touchstone of dissident thought in America. When I met with Howard Zinn, I asked him about his latest book, Terrorism and War, and about the politically engaged life he has led since he came home from the Air Force after World War II. You were a part of the force of World War II. You enlisted in the Air Force, became a bombardier in combat over Europe. You dropped lethal weapons on military and civilian targets below you. What was going through your mind when you do something like that?
Remember this, when you're bombing, you bomb from 30,000 feet, and that is 6 miles up. You don't see any people. You don't hear screams. You don't see blood. You don't see limbs being torn from people. You just see a target, and you're aiming for that target, and you've done this again and again. You've dropped bombs on targets where you never saw human beings. This is the nature of modern warfare, and this is why huge numbers of people can be killed, and they don't register as human beings to you. They kill at a distance. I'm sure the men who dropped the bombs on Hiroshima did not see what was going on down below. They were just bombing a target. So yes, I looked through the bomb sight, and I was just aiming for this target, which had been identified for me by the intelligence people before we went off. And so yeah, I developed a horror of modern warfare and the dehumanization of people. And maybe, I don't know if dehumanization is the right word. That is, in order to dehumanize people, you have to sort of know that they're human in the first place, and then you dehumanize them. But here you're not aware that there are human beings involved.
Tell me what happened over Royan.
Oh, that's this little town on the Atlantic coast of France. And that experience, I think, has something to do with that attitude towards war, even so-called good wars, that I developed after World War II. Little town on the Atlantic coast of France, and we thought, with my bomb group in East Anglia in England, thought we were not going to fly any missions anymore. The war was about to be over. It was a few weeks from the end. Everybody knew that. And then suddenly we were aroused in the middle of the night, told we're going to bomb this little town. Why? Well, they said, well, there are several thousand German soldiers there. They're not doing anything. Talk about preemptive.
Waiting. Left behind. By this time, the Allies had rolled across France.
Absolutely.
And these had been left behind a pocket.
Exactly. The Allies were across France into Germany. We're surprised that here are these German soldiers. They're just waiting there on the edge of the sea, waiting for the war to end, and we are going to bomb them. And so we sent, and I didn't know the number of bombers. It's interesting, when you were in a military operation, you don't see the larger picture. I knew our 12 bombers from our base were going over. I didn't know that 1,200 bombers were going over this tiny town. And
1,200?
1,200 bombers, yes, 1,200 heavy bombers, 1,200 B-17s went over this town of several thousand French people with the several thousand German soldiers around it. And we dropped what they called, this is what they told us in the briefing room, you're going to drop jellied gasoline instead of your usual demolition bombs. Napalm. It was the first use of napalm in the European theater. And we did this. I didn't even think about it twice. I mean, to this day, I know I can understand how atrocities are done by ordinary people. You know, what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil. I understand how, because I didn't even think about it. I was just trained to drop bombs. There's the enemy. You make a decision at the beginning of the war. They're the bad guys, you're the good guys, and therefore everything goes. And so we just did this. And so we destroyed the town of Royan, killed Frenchmen, killed women, children, killed the German soldiers. A victory. And when it was only afterwards, it was only after Hiroshima and Nagasaki that I thought about that. And then I thought about Dresden. And then I thought about the other killing of civilians in the war. Unnecessary even from the point of view of winning the war. And I thought war brutalizes everybody involved in it.
When did you realize that you had dropped napalm?
Well, I knew that we were dropping something called jelly gasoline, but I had no idea what it was.
When did you find that out?
Found it out later. No, actually, I hate to confess this, I really didn't find out what it did until the Vietnam War, when I began reading about napalm and realized that what they call jelly gasoline was this burning stuff that stuck to the skin of victims and tormented them before they died. I didn't really understand that until after the war. So now this is true of a lot of things that happen in war. Soldiers do things, airmen do things. They don't really know what they're doing.
If you and others had not been willing to do what you did, if the United States had been a more modest nation then, as you would have us be now, wouldn't Hitler and Mussolini have established control over all of Europe?
Probably. And World War II is a very special, complex case. And I was an enthusiastic bombardier. I enlisted. I was imbued with the idea of fighting fascism, and I dropped these bombs and so on. And yet, by the end of the war, or I should say maybe a little after the end of the war, I began to think about war in general. And maybe Hiroshima and Nagasaki had a powerful effect on me. And I began to see how war corrupts everybody who engages in it, and how, yes, we defeated Hitler and Mussolini, that's true. But at the end of all of that, with 50 million people dead, what was the world like? We'd gotten rid of these specific dictators, and now the world was dominated by two superpowers with enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons, and with tyranny not gone from the world, fascism not gone from the world, appearing in countries all over the world, and militarization not gone, racism not gone. And here was the war, presumably this was the war to end all wars. It wasn't. And so, what would have happened? It is very hard to go back over a scenario historically and try to imagine another scenario. And well, if there'd been bloody civil war in South Africa and apartheid were defeated, people would have said, now, can you imagine that it could have been defeated in some other way? You say, we can't imagine another scenario for World War II. That is a scenario, very hard to do it. And I
if you can
struggled
imagine
to
Hitler
do it.
and Mussolini out of existence.
Well,
You can't.
but
they were real.
Well,
It was a real threat. You responded to it.
Oh yes, they were real. They were real, and I don't know what the alternative might have been. You see, I don't know if there could have been a series of resistance movements inside Europe. Remember, the farther Hitler extended his reach in Europe, the weaker he became. So when he got to Norway, when he got to the Scandinavian countries, there were times when he had to yield to internal resistance. And so there were times, in history where powerful military machines ran out of steam. I mean, Napoleon in Russia. And I don't know what would have happened. It would have taken more time.
What about the argument that bombing Hiroshima and Nagasaki shortened the war by many months and saved hundreds of thousands of lives?
The only basis for saying that Hiroshima and Nagasaki saved hundreds of thousands of lives was to assume that the United States would have had to invade Japan in order to bring the war to an end. I've really studied that situation. I've really looked into it. I've really read the documents. I have read what is the most massive piece of research on it by Gar Alperovitz and others, the decision to drop the atomic bomb, you know. And I've read Richard Rhodes' book on it. I've read a lot of stuff on it and read the Japanese documents and so on. No, there was no need to invade Japan. Lives were not saved. Japan was on the verge of surrender. They had an emissary in Moscow negotiating terms of surrender. The only thing that stood between the Japanese and surrender was the status of the emperor. The United States would not grant the status of the emperor, and which was the only obstacle to the Japanese settling. And that's clear from telegrams which we intercepted. We had broken the Japanese code. So there were other motives. There are always other motives. You know, always other motives in war. This is an example of where the government says, oh, this is why we're doing this, but there are other motives.
Did you ever go to Hiroshima and Nagasaki?
I did. I went to Hiroshima in 1966. I was invited by this Japanese group that has a kind of, they put on something in Hiroshima every year, a kind of very solemn ceremony where everybody gathers just before the 8 o'clock in the morning when the bomb was dropped. Everybody gathers in silence to commemorate the dropping of the bomb. And then in a very eerie moment, because you're looking at the clock and it's getting to that moment, and then you hear an enormous sound and it's frightening in the silence because it sounds like bombs. It's a sound of thousands of doves being released into the air at that moment. That was what the Japanese were doing to commemorate the event, release thousands of doves into the air. But maybe the most troubling experience I had in Hiroshima was when I was invited along with other foreigners, Americans and others, to visit what was called sort of the House of Arrest in Hiroshima, which was a community center where victims of the bombing, people who had survived, but people who were disfigured or people who had lost arms or legs or who were blinded, would gather to, commune with one another. And we as international visitors were invited to talk to them. And I got up before them, because I was designated to be the American who would talk to them. And I got up and I had decided I must sort of confess to them that I was a bombardier in the Air Force. And as I started to say this, I looked out at these people sitting there so politely, blind people, people without limbs. I couldn't go on. I couldn't speak. I just could not bring myself to say anything. And I just sat down. But I think if Americans could see the human consequences of war, really, really see them, not as statistics, not as 1,000 people died or 2,000 people died, if they could see the human consequences of war, as we have seen the human consequences of September 11th and felt enormous compassion and anger, right, which we deserve to feel, if we Americans could see the human consequences of war in Afghanistan, of war in Iraq, if they could see the sight of that 10-year-old kid in Afghanistan who lost his eyes and lost his arms because of a bombing, American people would not support war. I fully believe that it is this impersonal aspect of war, that enables wars to go on.
But if the generation that fights a war like you fought against Hitler and the warlords of Japan, developed too overwrought a conscience? Will the next generation defend itself against the bullies of the world?
Defending itself is an expression that has to be looked upon very carefully, because the word defense is being used to cover all sorts of aggressive activity which are not defense. And we are not defending ourselves against terrorism when we bomb Afghanistan. We are not defending ourselves against Iraq when we go to war against Iraq, because defense means that somebody has attacked you, or somebody's in the process of attacking you, and you are defending yourself. But defense cannot cover preemptive action.
But with all due respect, if
Yes.
you were George W. Bush, you
Yeah.
would think after 9/11 that attacking the place from which the terrorist may well have come was self-defense. I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you.
Yeah.
I'm only saying that when you were inside,
Yes.
that
Oh, I think he can persuade himself. I think the people in Washington...
we were attacked. So the president, you're a student of the Constitution.
Sure, but
It talks about the common defense there.
Oh, sure. We were attacked, but then the question is, who attacked us? If we could locate the people who attacked us and get them, grab them, find them, okay, that's self-defense. But if we are attacked and we don't know who attacked us, and we just select a country from which we think the attackers may have sprung, and then just bomb that country, that is not defense. That is indiscriminate violence.
There was no doubt about where bin Laden was.
Yes, but it's like, there's no doubt that this murderer is hiding out in South Boston. So let's bomb South Boston, because he probably has even friends in South Boston who are hiding him out. Let's bomb South Boston. We may kill 1,000 people in South Boston, and by the way, we may not find the murderer. Will we call that defense? No, I don't think so. I think the word defense has to be looked at very carefully. The United Nations Charter defines defense, and it's not going after a country because somebody has attacked you. If that country attacks you and you are fighting back, that's defense.
I want to agree with you, but then I think back to the flames coming out of the Twin Towers on the 11th of September, and I think of those men who were willing to engage in the indiscriminate killing of civilian people.
Yes. There may be people like that around for a long time, and there have been. After all, that wasn't the first act of terrorism in the world. It was just the first act of terrorism in New York City.
Oh, in fact, I wanted to ask you about that, because you could say that the terrorists declared war on the United States in 1979 when the Iranian extremists seized the American embassy and held hostages for over a year. Then there was the attack on the Marine barracks in Lebanon that killed almost 300 American Marines. There were the bombings of the American embassy in Nairobi and Tanzania. There was Saddam Hussein's effort to kill former President Bush in 1994 when he went to Kuwait. You could say that the terrorists have been carrying on a war against the United States for a long time now, and that they have been encouraged by our ineffectual responses to them to believe that we're paper tigers, and that George W. Bush is at least saying to them, we're no longer a paper tiger.
We didn't always respond ineffectually, and we didn't always respond nonviolently. President Clinton responded to the bombings of the embassies with bombings, bombing the Sudan, right? Bombing Afghanistan. He responded with bombings. And
hitting a pharmaceutical company instead of a terrorist nest.
Exactly. And the point is that are terrorists going to be deterred? Are terrorists going to be scared if we react violently? No, they love it. That's what they dote on. They dote on violence. They dote on having more reasons to commit more terrorism. We solved the problem of the hostages in Iran by negotiations, and there are many situations where we engage in violence and in wars that could be solved by negotiations. And very often you think that the administration doesn't want negotiations, that it prefers war. And I think of Vietnam, where we preferred war to having an election in in Vietnam that would decide the fate
Preferred
of
victory.
Vietnam.
I mean, President
Yeah,
Johnson wanted to achieve a non-communist
Yeah.
South Vietnam.
That's right. But I think of all those instances, in which the United States, used force and which could have been determined by negotiation. I just recently read, in a book about the Korean War, scholarly book about the Korean War. Remember the Korean War, I mean, here was the typical situation, right? Somebody crosses a border, somebody invades, North Korea invades South Korea, the only thing to do is go to war. That's the mechanical automatic response. We go to war in Korea for 3 years. 2 million people get killed. At the end of it, where are we? At the end of it, we're where we were at the beginning. Dictatorship in North Korea, dictatorship in South Korea. 1 month, and this is what I get from Rosemary Foote's very scholarly book on the Korean War. 1 month into the Korean War, there was an opportunity to negotiate the North Korean withdrawal from South Korea, with India taking the initiative in creating this negotiation. The United States turned it down. And then millions of people are killed.
How would you have us fight terrorism?
What I'm suggesting is something that's more difficult than finding this one person or these 10 people, even though we have found that obviously very difficult, right? Finding Osama bin Laden. I'm suggesting something more fundamental, more difficult, and that is the changing of the posture of the United States in the world. To change our policy from being an oppressive superpower with its forces everywhere in the world, and with a record of using its forces which does not make a lot of people in the world look kindly upon us. So change our posture from a military superpower, to a humanitarian superpower. We are enormously wealthy. Let's use that wealth to send medicines to Africa. Let's use that wealth to help change social and economic conditions around the world. We don't need military bases around the world. Why do we need military bases everywhere?
Well, one argument would be Osama bin Laden has called on Muslims for one reason to attack the United States, because he says Americans are stationed on Saudi Arabia soil near the holy shrines of Mecca and other places that are sacred to the Muslims. And the bases are there because Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the Saudis asked us to come in and put those bases there. So again, what's the chicken and what's the egg here?
Well, I think that the American bases are there because the United States wants another toehold in the Middle East. After all, we've used the war on terrorism and the bombing of Afghanistan as a reason to establish more military bases in places around Afghanistan, in Central Asia, in Uzbekistan, in Kazakhstan, and then they have nothing to do with whether Saddam Hussein is going to invade Kuwait again. After all, it's a long historic experience of the United States for a long time, and especially since World War II, to establish military presence everywhere in the world that we can. And Saudi Arabia is just one of them. And sure, we always excuse it by saying, well, we're doing it for good purposes, for preventive purposes, but I don't really believe that. Do you know there's a fundamental problem here, and that is the credibility of the United States government. It's not just the United States government, the credibility of any government. Governments, and I remember I.F. Stone, the great journalist, would say this to journalism classes. He'd say, one thing you should remember, governments lie. Governments, we've learned this about governments all over the world. Dictatorial governments, so-called democratic governments, I mean, here's the United States. Our government has lied again and again, has deceived its people again and again about what it was doing in Vietnam, about what it was doing in Central America, about what it was doing in Indonesia. And so I don't believe the United States government when it says, oh, we care about terrorism. because the United States government is following policies that can only enhance terrorism and multiply terrorism, and it's not solving the fundamental problems that underlie terrorism.
You know, Howard, I am sympathetic to your argument, of course. Your work has had a great influence on me. A lot of people, however, say no matter what happens, even in the aftermath of September 11th, when 3,000 people were killed by terrorists, people like Howard Zinn are always blaming America for everything that goes wrong in the world.
Well,
and they don't listen.
Well, no, I don't blame America for everything that's gone wrong in the world. But I think I look at individual situations and decide whether America should be blamed. No, America can be blamed for September 11th. I mean, the terrorists did that terrible thing on September 11th. But the United States can be blamed for the kinds of things it's done in the world which do not arouse friendship but arouse enmity, and which therefore lead to terrorism.
Such as?
Well, if you go before, September 11th, if you go before the Gulf War, and then you look at the United States and its intervention in Vietnam, and several million people die. You look at the United States intervention in Central America, and we support death squad governments that kill hundreds of thousands of people, and more immediately in the Middle East, it's the problems that we spoke about. It's the sanctions on Iraq and the support of Israel at a time when anybody who really knows anything about the situation knows that Israel must get out of the occupied territories. The United States is the one power that's in a position to pressure Israel to get out of the occupied territories, and it doesn't. These are really serious grievances for the people in the Middle East. I'm not talking about grievances for terrorists, grievances for people who are not going to be terrorists. But out of those millions of people, a handful of terrorists will come. We have to deal with those grievances.
You're a student of history, and the history you've studied is the history of religion. Let me ask you this. Is it conceivable to you that there is something in the nature of, say, Islam, that irrespective of American offenses and American activities, is there something in the nature of that strain of Islam that could hate us for just being who we are?
I don't think so. There's something in every religion that creates the possibilities for violence, including the Old Testament, and including, the Christian. You could look at the record of Christian countries. That is, you could look at the record of the Christian fascist countries of Germany and Italy and Spain and the United States, and you might ask, is there something inherent in Christianity? Is there something there?
Yes, there could be. So is there something in Islam?
So.
You don't think so?
No, I don't think so, because you find these characteristics across the religious board. But religion is always a handy thing to pin the problem on. And also it makes the problem inoperable, unsolvable, because religion is so deeply.
God told me there's no debating, right?
That's right. But I don't believe that. And
but the Islamists, the bin Laden followers, are always invoking Allah, always invoking their faith.
Sure, and we have Christian fundamentalists in the United States who are invoking their faith,
but they didn't fly planes into the World Trade Center.
Oh, but they've done other things. They've supported our wars. We had priests and ministers, blessing the wars that we fought overseas. I remember, Cardinal Spellman in New York, blessing the wars that we're fighting in Korea and Vietnam. So yes, it's always helpful to people who make wars to find a religious support for it. But I don't think that is crucial, because I think the evil in the world cuts across religious lines.
Back to something you said earlier, it's impossible in fighting a war to avoid civilian casualties. Is your conclusion that we should not fight wars then because there will be civilian casualties?
Yes. Yes.
Does this make you a pacifist?
No. I avoid the word pacifist. And the reason I avoid it is that it suggests passivity. That is, people think of pacifists as somebody who's going to sit by and do nothing while, maybe meditate, while terrible things go on in the world. No. I believe that we cannot sit idly by while terrible things are going on, while tyrannies exist, while people are starving, while people are dying. I think I keep coming back to the fact that political tyrannies like Iraq have to be juxtaposed against other problems in the world, which are very, very serious. The more people die each day of hunger every day than were killed in that one day, in the Twin Towers. So I don't believe in passivity. I believe we should do something about these problems, but we should not do war, because war makes things worse than they were before. War has consequences which you cannot predict, you see, and unintended consequences and inevitable consequences. And so I think we've reached that point in history. At least I like to think we've reached that point in history, where we stop thinking we can solve problems with violence, and when we look for other kinds of solutions. The other kinds of solutions are not being passive. The other kinds of solutions are what I would call nonviolent direct action. Action you take, but action which is not at the level of wartime violence, war-making violence.
So if people agree with you, what can they do?
Well, what they can do is, people everywhere, first of all, must build up resistance movements against their own governments when their governments are behaving tyrannically, when their governments are behaving aggressively, when their governments are making war. And people must look for nonviolent solutions to terrible things. I think of South Africa, and I think of how at a certain point the African National Congress had to make a decision. And the decision was, shall we engage in bloody civil war, armed struggle in South Africa, because what could be worse than apartheid? Talk about tyranny, talk about evil. What could be worse than apartheid, semi-slavery for the majority black population in South Africa? The African National Congress decided no. We might win this war if we engage in blood. We could get arms from the outside. We get support. We might win this war against the apartheid regime, but in the course of it, 1 million black people will die. We don't know how many people will die. And they decided to embark on a course of, it wasn't passivity. It was a series of tactics, of strikes and boycotts and bringing the international community to put economic pressure and to do all sorts of things, sabotage. Violence was not eliminated. And Nelson Mandela went to prison for advocating, not violence against people, interestingly enough. He went to prison for advocating sabotage, violence against property, which is tolerable for a good cause, whereas violence against people is not. Now, so what I'm suggesting is the human race has reached that point where it has to reject war, that is the indiscriminate killing of innocent people, as a way of solving problems, and it must use this ingenuity, which we presumably have, with which we can go to the moon, must use its ingenuity to figure out ways of solving the problems of the world without war.
This book, A People's History of the United States, has sold 1 million or more copies, and it's taught in colleges and universities around the country. What did you learn writing this?
I learned a lot.
About American history, though. You look at American history in this book as no one else had until then.
Yeah.
This book sent you down paths other historians had not traveled.
Yeah, that's true. And it was because I didn't know what I would come up with. I did not know when I started out what I would come up with. I only knew one thing, and that is that I wanted to write a book about the United States which would tell the stories of people whose stories had not been told before. And I wanted to tell about American history from viewpoints that had never been heard before. That is, I knew that I wanted to tell the story of wars from the standpoint of GIs and not generals, and tell a story of economic progress, the great American economic miracle, from the standpoint of working people, from the standpoint of the Irish immigrants and Chinese immigrants who worked on the transcontinental railroad. I knew I wanted to tell the story of the United States from the point of view of dissenters, not from the point of view of the government, not from the point of view of the people in power. That I knew, but I didn't know what that would mean. And so it started right out with Columbus. And
I remember that furor. You painted Columbus. I mean, you acknowledged his skills as a mariner, but you went on to point out that he was vicious in his treatment of the native people whom he enslaved, tortured, and murdered, all in the pursuit of wealth. I mean, there was an enormous furor over that.
Well, probably because it was the first chapter in the book. I didn't like to think that people just read the first chapter, but that did cause more consternation than anything else in the book. And I think that's because all these people in the United States had the same experience I did. Maybe all of us did.
I did.
Yeah, we all went to school and we learned about Columbus, the great man, the great navigator, the religious man, the great adventurer, et cetera, et cetera. And the truth is, and I don't like to admit this, when I started to write about Columbus, I didn't know the facts about Columbus. I knew that I wanted to look at Columbus from the standpoint of the Indians. I mean, but I didn't know what that would mean. And then I read Bartolomé de las Casas, the Spanish priest who was there on Hispaniola, where Columbus was operating. And I read his history of the Indies, and I was astonished, taken aback. Columbus suddenly, not a navigator, but a murderer, a man who mutilated Indians, a man who kidnapped Indians, enslaved them, a man who was motivated, not by religious conviction, and although that's what he talked about. I mean, there's an early instance of people presenting one motive and having others, motivated by greed, gold, the search for gold, and that was a starting point. And so I told the story of Columbus from the standpoint of the Arawak Indians, these peaceable people whom Columbus then treated so savagely when he arrived here. And that then gave me the clue. I went on. Oh yeah, what about the American Revolution? Am I going to talk about Washington and Franklin and Jefferson? No, what about the working people? What about the people left out of the American Revolution? What about the slaves who were not freed by the American Revolution? What about the Native Americans who were going to lose out because the Americans, colonists, were going to drive the British away and then move into Indian lands? What about the soldiers who mutinied against Washington? And I didn't know about that until I looked into it. Oh, mutinies against Washington. Conflict between soldiers and their officers. Class conflict in the Revolution. This became a theme throughout the book. Class conflict, always overlooked.
You kept reshuffling our heroes and our villains, and describing the Founding Fathers, as you just said, as rich white slaveholders, merchants, bondholders, fearful of the lower classes. You described our military heroes like Andrew Jackson and Theodore Roosevelt as racists, imperialists, war lovers.
That sounds bad.
Well, I mean, you upset a lot of people.
Well, yeah. And sometimes people would say to me, what are you doing? You're getting rid of our heroes. We need heroes. Kids, our children, they need heroes to look up to. And I would agree, they need heroes to look up to, but not these heroes. They don't need Theodore Roosevelt as a hero. They don't need as a hero a man who was a war lover, a man who supported the invasion of the Philippines, who congratulated the general for committing a massacre on the Philippines. No, that's not a hero. Let these young people have as a hero Mark Twain, who denounced Theodore Roosevelt for what was going on in the Philippine War. Let them have as a hero not Woodrow Wilson, who got us into World War I for reasons which people are still trying to figure out. let them have as a hero Helen Keller, who protested against World War I. Instead of having Andrew Jackson as a hero who killed Indians, was an Indian hater, really, and who used the army to drive Indians out of their homes. Talk about ethnic cleansing, that was it. Drive Indians out of their homes. Instead of him, let's use the Cherokees who were driven out and who tried to resist. Let's use them as heroes.
What's more important to a people, truth or mythology?
Well, I think truth is important. I think
truth doesn't inspire the way mythology inspires. Well, truth sometimes depresses.
Truth can be depressing. And of course, a good part of the truth is depressing. But there is a part of the truth which is not mythology, that it's not made up, and it's not depressing, it's really ennobling, it's really inspiring, because sure, you can tell the story of the Depression in a way that makes people feel bad. But you don't have to invent myths to find really inspiring stories that come out of the Depression of working people in the Ford plants and General Motor plants who were working under terrible conditions and who then went out on strike to change their conditions, and they were arrayed against the most powerful industrialists in the country, in Ford and General Motors, and arrayed against soldiers and police. And they went on strike and they persisted and they sat in on the plants and they won. And they changed the conditions of their lives. Those aren't myths. Those are real stories. I mean, the story of the civil rights movement, you don't need myths. You know.
But what good does it do to tell people that their heroes who have inspired them have clay feet?
Well, it's good because then it warns them about other people who are going to be set before them as heroes. And it warns them to scrutinize these people who are put up as heroes and ask, what did they really do? And what did other people do?
I mean, when A People's History of the United States appeared, you would have been charged with an assault with a deadly weapon, a book, if they could have. It really upended people's conceptions. Mm. And yet at the same time, didn't it liberate a lot of other people to start writing in the same vein and telling other stories that had been undiscovered or untold in American history?
I hope so. I don't know how much to attribute it to my book. Of course, I'd love to attribute everything good to my book. But it's true that, that after my book appeared, we began to see more and more books about Native American history, about women's history, about the history of dissenters. I'd like to think, not that that was the result of my book, although my book encouraged people to do that. I think it did that. But I think maybe it's more accurate to say that all of this sudden new interest in black history and women's history and the history of dissenters came out of the movements of the 60s, of the anti-war movement, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the gay and lesbian movement, the disabled people's movement, you know. I think all of those movements, they stimulated me, they stimulated other writers, and so we have a new literature, fortunately.
If you were writing a history of America today, if you were going to revise A People's History, what would be your focus, your theme?
I would, for instance, I suppose, be looking at those people who are dissenting from both the Republican and Democratic parties in what seems to be their united determination or willingness. Determination on the one part, willingness on the other part to go to war. I would be concentrating on the protesters. I would be talking, yes, I'd be talking about the terrorist act, the terrible terrorist act of September 11th, but then I wouldn't portray Bush as a hero responding to that. I would talk to Amber Amundsen, a woman whose husband, a pilot, was killed in the Pentagon on September 11th with the crash into the Pentagon, and who wrote a letter to President Bush saying, "My husband would not have wanted you to respond to this act of terrorism by waging war on other people and killing innocent people." I would talk to those people who now call themselves Families for Peaceful Tomorrows, these families of victims, and I've met a number of them, families of people who are victims of the Twin Towers and who are saying, "We don't want war. That is not the proper response to terrorism. We are against terrorism, whether it comes from Osama bin Laden or whether it comes from the United States government." So I would talk to people like that. I would also talk to people who are suffering as a result of the government spending enormous sums of money on war. I mean, $200 million for one F-22 fighter. Government spending enormous sums of money on war while there are people who are cold in this miserable winter that we are experiencing right now. I'm living in Boston, and now I'm in New York, and in both cities it is bitterly cold, and there are people who either are out on the street or they're in their homes and they don't have heating oil. They can't afford to pay their oil bills, and the government is cutting back on the heating oil. I would talk to these people, you know, and because they're the overlooked ones.
Does it depress you to believe you're right and know you're marginalized, that the people in power don't listen to that kind of petition?
It doesn't depress me to know that the people in power don't listen to me, because I'm used to that. That is, people who are dissidents are accustomed to the people in power not listening. And the reason we are not discouraged is we feel that they will not listen and not listen and not listen, and movements will grow and grow and grow, and one day the movement will grow strong enough so that they will have to listen. I've seen that happen. We've all seen it happen. We saw it happen in the civil rights movement. The government did not listen. Kennedy and Johnson, liberals, did not listen when the civil rights movement called for protection against violence in the South. They did not listen. Congress did not listen. They did not pass new legislation until the movement grew to the point where they could not ignore it. Same thing happened during the war in Vietnam. And so I'm not discouraged because I'm encouraged. When you talk about being marginalized, I don't feel marginalized because the administration is not listening, because I know there are very, very large numbers of people in the country who feel as I do.
Where do you see effective dissent today?
Today? Well, of course, we don't know yet the effects of dissent. It's too early in the anti-war movement. Although, I mean, you can point to small effects, but you know, we're not seeing any large effect of the anti-war movement. But I am seeing the movement growing. I am seeing anti-war meetings, teach-ins, rallies, vigils taking place in cities and towns all over the country. Little towns, 4 towns in Montana, 5 towns in Alaska, places where we never had an anti-war movement. I see, yes, all these signs of a movement growing, not yet reaching the point where it has affected policy. But when I say small signs, I feel that the rhetoric of the Bush administration, when it is not saying, oh, we're gonna go to war, when it's not saying that, it is saying, oh, well, we would like there to be a peaceful solution. In other words, there are moments.
Yeah, well, they went to the UN.
Yeah, that's right.
I think
that's right. And I believe that going to the UN was in part a result of the feeling that there's not enough support for the war.
You remind me of the poem the women in the garment district used to recite to one another. Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. You are many, they are few. But that was another time. People don't talk that way anymore.
Well, they're not that eloquent. But the feeling is there. I mean, that feeling must exist among all these people who protest, even though they know that their protest is not immediately being listened to. And I think it comes from a sense of history. It comes from a sense that this has happened before. It's happened before that people have protested and apparently not been listened to, and yet at a certain point they had to be listened to. It comes from reading the poets and knowing that ultimately the poets will have the last word.
Does it strike you that the bad things that happen in history keep happening? War, violence. The good things that happen are unexpected.
But that's a very good point. That's an important point, because it should give us some hope for the future, that we get surprising, unexpected things that happen. A dictator suddenly, whose power we thought was absolute. I think of Marcos in the Philippines, or I think of Trujillo in the Dominican Republic, or Batista in Cuba. These people whose power seemed absolute over their people. You wake up one morning and there are 200,000 people in the streets of their capital city, and the dictator is fleeing quickly on a helicopter, carrying his loot with him, finding some country that will give him safe haven. Surprise. We've been surprised so many times. I think that's important for people to keep in mind who get discouraged. We've been surprised. We've been surprised by, Franco Spain disappearing and a new kind of Spain.
The collapse of the Soviet Union.
Collapse of the Soviet
dissolving
Union.
almost overnight.
Oh yeah, different things happening in Eastern Europe. We've been surprised so many times. We're surprised in this country by the end of racial segregation when it looked impossible in the early 1950s. Surprised by so many things. And that's why the historical perspective, while I said that, as a historian I couldn't predict, and it's still true, but history is useful in giving you the kind of perspective which doesn't allow you to get discouraged, because you've seen too many times in the past when people were discouraged, but something surprised them. Something that was building up under the surface, and then emerged, and something happened. I'm still hopeful for America.
So this is what makes a historian, even a historian who's at home with the brutalities, the wars, the violence, the depressions of the past, the ravages of the past, you remain optimistic.
Yeah, I do, because of what I've seen is possible in history, what I've experienced myself being involved in social movements, and also because of the people I see. If you look on television only, and all you see is the Secretary of Defense and the President and the experts, that's very discouraging. But if you go out and talk to people, and you meet people all over the country who have some common sense and who are thinking for themselves and who are not accepting what is being told to them, and you run into people who are going on vigils and writing letters, or even people who are not doing any of those things but merely beginning to think for themselves, that gives you some hope.
Thank you very much, Howard Zinn.
Thanks for having me.
Funding for this series is provided by the Herb Alpert Foundation, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, and by Mutual of America. For over half a century, people from all walks of life have turned to Mutual of America for retirement and pension products.